Hey everyone, so today we're going to do a non-proportional dot inventory. Hopefully you've already watched the proportional dot inventory that I did yesterday, but today is the non-proportional one. So very much like the first one, you're still focused on pulling a palette from an observed source. So the main difference between these is just it comes down to how complex your source is. Non-proportional dot inventories are going to be a great option for natural objects, found objects that have a lot of complex color, right? So I'm going to use my rock specimen today. It's borrowed from my sister's kind of display case. She's a geologist, right? So she told me all types of things that are in here. So there's some quartz, there's some pyrite, but you guys can see that there's a lot of variation of color. And when we're talking about variation of color, it's not always the hue source that's changing so much, but it's more the value or saturation, right? So how light or dark the color is, how intense the color is, and I still have a very decent range of all of those things, right? So I have oranges that are a little bit more prismatic, are they straight out of the tube like my red and yellow? No. But as as intense as rocks get, these are still really vivid colors, right? I have some deeper purples in there. I have a little bit like shinier purples. I have the reflectiveness of some of the materials in the rock. That can be, maybe some really intense highlights, that kind of thing, right? So I'm still going to assess all of the colors that I see. I still want to condense it down to about 8 to 20 colors. 8 is a good kind of like, it gets you enough information about what you see without being too oversimplified. And 20 is like, you're starting to push, the boundaries of doing all of the colors, right? Because I could be here for quite some time and find, new variations of each subtle color. And it also depends on how much light you have, the type of light source. If I hold my hand over it, things are going to appear a lot darker than when it has that direct above, artificial light, right? So what you see is constantly going to change depending on your settings, right? So I've got my nice round brush. With this dot inventory to be non-proportional, you don't paint proportional bars like the last one where, I think purple is maybe like 1/8 of the color that's in there. This one, because it's so complex, would take you a lot longer to assess, the proportional quality. It's all about just kind of swatching the colors that you see in more of like a dot inventory motif, right? So I'm going to start with, a couple. I'm going to start with this kind of orange that I see. It's not so intense. I'm going to add a little bit of black and white to it to kind of mute it down. Get some of these nice, pretty colors. Despite this being a pretty natural source, it's still got a lot of color in it, right? So I always like, found objects, leaves work really great for this. This is one of the few orange colors that I see. It's a little bit more muted, right? So maybe more in here, right? So I've got this kind of nice, like golden yellow. And again, depending on how much, pure color that you add into each swatch, you're gonna deal with some transparency of the paint, and that's okay. I'm going to kind of pump up a little bit darker of a version to get that really kind of iron-esque color. Iron-esque is such a nice word. Remember, because you're not also doing proportional swatches, you don't have to add as much paint, right? This might go a little quicker for some of you. Add just a tad bit more black to that. I think this is a good color for some of those deeper browns. Right? And so you can kind of make your dots. They don't have to be perfect circles. Mine definitely are not perfect circles, right? But it's just to kind of, you're assessing the color as you go. It's more on the fly. And again, 8 to 20 is a solid range because if you start adding too many colors, if you're going, for 30, 40, this can be a kind of therapeutic process, right? So some of you might like choose that route to kind of continue on, but you'll notice that a lot of the colors are just subtle shifts in value or saturation of like a color that's easy to kind of shift on your own, right? So I've got 3 good ranges of kind of hue shifts, but also value and saturation shifts is some of the things that I see. I'm going to go for a little bit lighter of a highlight of that yellow. I'm using my cadmium yellow today instead of my lemon yellow. It's a little bit warmer, right? And some of those oranges I thought would be better suited with the cadmium instead of, the really intense highlighter yellow is what I like to call it. But I know it's a little hard to see some of these lighter yellow colors, right? But there's mine. I feel like I definitely see some of that floating around. I also have this kind of very pale greenish hue, right? It's really, really subtle. I'm using both my phthalo and my ultramarine today for my assessment because my ultramarine is going to be that better option for some of those purple colors. I'm going to add some of this orange into this because I feel like I need to have that kind of greenish hue, more muted. It's a very light color, but I like that one. And so when you are doing this non-proportional inventory, everyone's going to capture colors a little differently, right? So what your neighbor thinks is an important color is not what you're going to think of an important color. So when you're assessing, complex visual objects like a rock or a leaf that's natural or coral or fish, this can apply to a lot of different things that have a lot more complex color. Go for the colors that you're attracted to. It doesn't always have to be what everyone else is doing, right? Because it's your painting at the end of the day. I'm going to add just a little bit more of that kind of orangish hue, right? I'm adding some of that complement in to dull down my saturation of my purple. I'm going to paint that swatch about here. Oh yeah, I'm digging that. Still getting a lot of color, despite the fact that these are all very kind of muted or chromatic tones. There's still a ton of color in something that, at first glance is very dull and not as intense, right? You still get a lot of good color options. And when you have a palette that's like this, that has a lot of very muted or chromatic tones, when you have one color that's really intense, things are going to stand out a lot more, right? So, if everything else around one color is like super rich in saturation, it's going to really pop, right? So it can be a nice, interesting focal point on your page, right? So I'm going to add a little bit more of that kind of really shiny gray highlight. Adding a lot of white. I just want it to be off-white, right? So I kind of want to pull some of this ultramarine in. See what that gets me. I'll dig with that, right? It's just so subtly. I know that's going to be probably one of the hardest colors to see. You guys can see that it's just not the white of the page, right? For some of those kind of silvery-esque highlights. But I also have a little bit of natural cool light coming in, so I am going to do one that's a little bit more blue because I do see some of that. And I already have 9 colors, right? So I'm going to do one more of these highlights. I'm going to switch to some of those more muted tones, natural tones that you see here, right? And really kind of assess, right? So you guys can see how easy it is to kind of get not carried away, but just keep mixing colors that you see with some of these more complex, source materials. Becomes quite tricky. I'm gonna throw a little bit more of that crimson in, getting closer to that brown. Let's warm that up. Going for more of this kind of it's purpley, but it is very unsaturated, like a brown hue. That's close. Now I'm not going to swatch on my mineral because my sister would find me and she would not be pleased if this is one of her favorite specimens. But if you don't have access to the whole object, you can definitely find source material just working off an image online. If you Google mineral specimens and do science professional quality, kind of refine the search, you're going to get a lot more interesting things. So I'm going to throw in both of my blues. I should have started with my ultramarine and my cadmium because ultramarine is more purple in nature. The greens it makes are a little bit more dull, which is what I'm looking for. If I do my phthalo and my cadmium, I'm still going to get some really intense grass greens. That's not quite the color I'm going for. Let's kind of pump that back up. Lost a little bit of my greenish hue. That's better. Maybe a little bit darker. I like that color better. All right. Now, when you're also swatching these, I'm going to try to stop at 15, right? Because the longer I do, I don't want my video to be so long, you guys lose interest. But when you're doing this as well, right, know that you're finding the colors that you feel are most important. And then if you feel you're you still have your visual resource, and if you didn't do a swatch of it, you're maybe I should push this a little bit darker in value, or maybe I'll just, I need to adjust this. at the end of the day, you're kind of doing this color research, you're sourcing a palette, but that doesn't, bar you from the artistic license to start changing some of those colors that you originally swatched, right? So you still have that freedom to kind of go around and be like, maybe I need a little bit more of this hue. Maybe I'm not quite where I want it to be, right? So you have all the freedom to take like this color and maybe I want it more intense. Maybe I want the hue source to shine through. Maybe I want it to be a tad darker, right? You have all those options to kind of play around with how you use your palette. Get a little bit more of kind of like this little very soft, very subtle kind of pinkish hue highlight. So a lot more color in here than I originally thought. I'm gonna go for a little bit of a cooler kind of gray tone. Not that cool, one overboard. I'm a messy mixer. Messy, messy, messy. Kind of get that nice neutral tone. Awesome. Now, I'm kind of working as I go, and I don't feel like, in the beginning, I always recommend people when they're mixing and, you're kind of mixing on the fly, take a little bit extra time and write down your color combinations, right? So if you're like, I'm never going to remember this, 10 minutes from now, how I got this color, write it down, right? Right next to these swatches, you can kind of do a shorthand, create like a little recipe for yourself. I always find that really helpful and really useful. So that's always a fantastic, like really good option to kind of keep track until you become more comfortable with color mixing, especially with this kind of pigment. And then you can, once you have more experience and you feel more confident, you don't have to write down as much, right? You'll understand more like the inherent value of color and like which red or which yellow you need, and you can kind of go a little bit at a time, kind of like what I'm doing, where you're just more mixing and just like, it's more intuitive. The longer you color mix, the more intuitive it'll become for you to kind of work through some of this, right? So I'm gonna do one more highlight. I lied, I said I was gonna do 15, but 16 seems like such a more pleasing number. I just want it to be a little bit more purple, but I want it to be really light. So I'm gonna grab a little more white. Remember, I'm using acrylic paint, but you could do something like this with any kind of drawing, painting material. It doesn't have to be paint. All right, let's see if this is different. Ooh, yes. That's more of the kind of reflective highlight I need. I'm gonna do one more dark color. You guys can see that this can become really kind of fun, a fun thing to do, especially on like, you've watched all the shows you could possibly watch, or you're just needing to do something else with your time. We all have quite a bit of time on our hands right now. This is a great option to kind of get your brain to think about something else and still feel very productive. All right, do that nice dark color. It was lacking kind of a very nice contrast with dark. All right, so here is my palette. I have 17 colors, right? I'm kind of really getting close to that maximum number, but I'm pretty happy with my palette. There's a lot more colors in that rock that I saw, or I felt like I saw. And I'm pulling out colors that, that green that you see here is minimal on the backside of the rock. It's not everywhere, right? My rock is really kind of made up of some of those like grayer, more muted chromatic gray tones, but I'm picking out colors that I'm like, this could be an interesting palette, right? So hopefully you guys enjoyed this process, and I'll see you next time.